It's easy as academics to get super focused on what you're doing at the bench and not even think about scaling stuff until you're like convinced it's perfect. Similar to the customer discovery, it's never really too early to start looking at your IP position and talking to experts on building an IP strategy. I believe that a lot of these renewable chemicals sort of technologies, including ours, but some of the other cool tech that's coming up, I think they'll be implemented earlier than people think.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Science VC, a podcast about deep tech startups, venture capital, and more. I'm JP Orlov, and my guest today is Alexander Ip. Alex is the CEO of CERT Systems, a climatetech startup that turns CO2 emissions into high-value chemicals. CERT was founded in Canada, and it converts emissions into molecules that are chemically identical to those typically derived from fossil fuels. These molecules happen to be the building blocks for everyday products like plastics. I enjoyed talking with Alex not only about the sustainability aspect of this technology, but also the advantage of not needing to import fossil fuels. Expect to learn how to scale your development effectively, why you need to talk to customers from day one, how to leverage non-dilutive capital, and much more. Alex, welcome to the show. Thank you very much for doing this. I'm very excited.
Yeah, happy to be here, JP. Very excited as well.
Great. I wanted to start with the origin story of CERT Systems. I wanted to ask you, how did you meet Christine and how this whole journey began?
Yeah. So even to start with CERT Systems, I think you have to go even a little bit further back. So I was doing my PhD at the University of Toronto. I was actually working on solar materials at the time. Sometime in the middle of my PhD, solar started becoming very cheap. We were getting a lot of solar cells over from China. So nobody really cared about solar materials anymore. So when I finished my PhD, we started asking the question about what do we do in a world where there is a lot of renewable electricity? And so I moved away from the bench more into a partnerships role as we were starting a new research program on CO2 conversion. That's when Christine actually joined the team as a postdoctoral fellow. And there we started working really closely together in the Carbon X Prize, which was this competition at the time to look at any sort of technology that could convert CO2 into something valuable. And so from that, we really enjoyed that process and we decided to spin out CERT Systems and make a run at commercializing the technology.
Taking CO2 into something valuable. CO2 is usually seen as a waste. What are we talking about when you say something valuable?
Yeah. So what we are focused on is making some of the essential chemicals that the world uses, but instead of using fossil fuels to make them, we want to use that carbon dioxide to make those chemicals instead. In particular, we're focused on making ethylene, which is the most used carbon-based chemical in the world. Currently has a market of about $200 billion. Over 200 million tons of it are made every year. It goes into things like plastics and textiles, building materials, all sorts of things. And so right now we're reliant on fossil fuels to make this sort of chemical. And we think that, the carbon atoms are exactly the same. So why not use CO2, which, as you say, people consider a waste, but use that instead as the source of these essential chemicals that we rely on.
Why the time is now to do this? Why haven't we relied on this CO2 conversion before?
I mean, obviously the whole fossil fuel and petrochemical industry over the past, century or so has really grown, really developed. And so without kind of a reason to change, it's been easy. That's kind of what we relied on to do it. But I think in the past couple of decades, we've obviously started to notice that we keep relying on fossil fuels to do all this. Things aren't going to be going so well. And so there are a few kind of drivers that are pushing this along. One is on the regulatory side. You see that, different countries are bringing in different sorts of policies, whether that's, carbon taxes or mandates on the amount of sustainable content. The second one is that people are demanding more sustainable options, right? People want to see the products that they make be more sustainable. A lot of these products rely on chemicals as kind of like the building block to get them. And so petrochemical companies are obviously looking to change this. A third one, more particular to our technology, is the electrification of everything. We're really getting into a world where everything is electric. And we think that using more electrically driven ways of producing these chemicals is an enormous driver to move to new technologies such as ours. And the fourth one that's actually really relevant in maybe the past month or so is supply chain resiliency. When there's different sorts of geopolitical tensions, supply chains can be really at risk if they're relying on fossil fuels from certain sources. And materials being passed through different countries. And so, using CO2 means that you can kind of decouple from, where fossil resources are available. And it can allow you to build up more, resiliency within your own supply chain. And so that's actually a kind of a newer, but, fairly large driver that, we're seeing as well.
I can imagine having that resilience, that autonomy brings a lot to countries to not rely on not only fossil fuels, but let's not forget that fossil fuels means bringing it from other parts of the world. That's really interesting.
Exactly. Yeah.
At what moment while you were doing your research on this topic, you realized that this had the potential to become commercially viable? Because it sounds very interesting, all the points that you're listing, but I'm really curious because you have to take that from the lab into the market.
I don't think it was any like singular moment where this happened. I think it was definitely, while we were, participating in the X Prize. One thing is like, we really enjoyed the process of scaling things up, not just being kind of tied, to a bench and running small scale experiments, but actually seeing that, the process is scalable. We were able to build out a larger unit and operate it. So that showed us, technically, the process was possible to scale. And I think the other part that showed us that it was a commercially viable, process was that there was a lot of interest coming from, larger corporations and, that, weren't using these sorts of technologies now. They would be already currently reliant on fossil fuels, but they kind of saw that, something has to change. Don't know if it's going to be like 5 years, 10 years or what. But there's really a need for new ways of making these, essential chemicals. And so, we noticed that there weren't really solutions available in the market, for these sorts of chemicals. And so we had a big opportunity to further scale and develop the technology and really be that solution, for the essential chemicals space.
You mentioned corporations. What industry is mostly interested in what CERT is developing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would split it kind of into two main camps right now. So ethylene itself is a really long value chain. So at the front end of it, way upstream, you have the chemical producers, often integrated petrochemical companies that are currently generating fossil fuels and then, making ethylene, among other things from there. So that's one space. And the other one is way at the tail end, kind of where you're looking more at finished goods that are made starting from ethylene. So a lot of this would be, things that are, using plastics, often for packaging, but it could also be, structural materials. And so this is where I said before, one of the big drivers is, from the general public. Those end of value chain companies, like consumer facing brands, they're listening to what their customers are demanding, and those customers are often demanding more sustainable solutions. And so they are trying to go upstream to their suppliers and say, hey, can you get me, the same sort of materials we're using? We know it works well, but we want it to be more sustainable. And then because that gets all the way up to that, those upstream players, and they say, well, we can't make it that much more sustainable. We're still using fossil fuels to make it. We got to find other sorts of feedstocks. That's where they start looking at things like CO2. Can we use CO2 as a source, to make these sorts of basic chemicals? And if we're able to do it from that point, then you can kind of decarbonize all the way down that value chain to the plastics, to the finished goods that, people are buying off the shelf.
How do you think these players on the last steps on the value chain can communicate this benefit into their clients? Because I think it's great to have this novel way of producing, but I'm just asking myself, how will consumers see that on the shelves and see that this has something very good behind during the production process? Do you have any thoughts around how companies can communicate that?
Yeah, I think this is a really important space, because ultimately what we're trying to do is make sure that, people can use materials, and have products that have the same properties that they're used to. So they work the same way, and they almost shouldn't notice any difference in the way that they actually interact with it. Kind of on a different way of thinking about that is, from a sustainability standpoint, drinking straws, people have moved to the paper straws, and I haven't met any one person who says, yeah, I like paper straws, because they don't behave the same as the plastic ones. They work worse, right? And so I think communicating that we're able to maintain the high performance and quality that people are used to, but then being able to say, hey, this now has zero carbon or even negative carbon impact is going to be really, really important. So people can feel good that, they're making a more sustainable choice, while not having to sacrifice, their experience with the product, I think is really important. And so there's a bit of education, I think, but I think people know what a carbon footprint is. And so being able to say, like, this has a lower carbon footprint, has lower carbon impact, but you don't have to sacrifice anything, is kind of how to message that.
I'm just trying to remember all the potential, all the good areas that this technology has, but let's pretend I'm the CEO of a big petrochemical company. What's the most important part that I should be aware of what CERT Systems is doing?
Yeah. So I think, for somebody in the petrochemical space, I think this is where we have an opportunity to, provide ways for you to, sell more sustainable materials to your customers. And I know they've been hearing the demands from these end of chain players who say, we want more sustainable goods. We don't want to sacrifice any performance. This also gives you a way of addressing any of the carbon pricing or policies that are coming in. It allows you to be in compliance with that. But you don't have to change your entire value chain because the materials you're making are exactly the same. And I think a third thing that's really good for the way that we're envisioning our technology working with conventional petrochemical players is that it gives them an opportunity to transition. These companies have put in billions and billions of dollars into the infrastructure to produce and process ethylene, right? And so they want to hold on to what they're doing because they don't want to write all that off. So what we're able to provide is a way that they can take the emissions that are coming off their current assets, transform that into a sustainable ethylene product that is chemically identical to what they're making from fossil fuels. And because it's chemically identical, they can just feed it back into the processing that they have. And that means that now, without changing their polymerizer, they can now make plastics that have lower carbon footprint. They can make, coolants or other chemicals that, again, exactly the same, but have lower chemical or lower carbon footprint. And so I think this is an opportunity to allow them to gradually transition, take advantage of the existing assets so that, they don't have to give up on some of those sunk costs that they've already put into existing infrastructure.
So you're saying that big petrochemical companies would be able to take their emissions, use it as a feedstock without relying on importing the feedstock, and then they are able to produce the same performing material, which is ethylene?
Yeah. So their emissions, so they might be currently using fossil fuels to produce the ethylene, and when they produce that ethylene, they're currently creating emissions. So we can start taking those emissions and then make it into the same ethylene, mix it with their fossil-based stream, and then you can kind of gradually tune that where they start to wean off the amount of fossil ethylene that's being created and increase the amount of CO2 based ethylene that we're able to make, and then gradually transition that over to more and more sustainable content.
How complicated would you say is to integrate CERT Systems technology into the current manufacturing process? Because that sounds very, very interesting. I'm already excited, but I'm trying to figure out how hard it is to actually implement.
This is another area where we've thought about it and spoken to a number of different operators. So in a chemical refinery, they tend to be very highly integrated, and they don't want to have any sort of downtime or anything, because when you shut it down, you're losing like millions of dollars every hour if you're not running it. So I think what's really important for us is that our process kind of is able to operate in parallel to the existing setup. So we'd be looking at retrofitting some carbon capture to the existing emissions. And there are different sources in a refinery. So we try and go after the more easily accessible ones first. Take that and we just operate our process off to the side. It doesn't interfere with anything that's already happening. After we generate our ethylene, that can be fed in and just mixed with the existing stream of ethylene and other byproducts that they have, and they have all the existing purification and processing equipment there. And so there's a lot of reduced risk if, we're piloting a technology and our system goes down for some reason, then they just kind of go back to the status quo for a little bit while we fix it, and their operations don't need to be shut down. And when we are operating, then we're reducing their emissions and increasing their ethylene yield. So that's how we see it for any of these petrochemical companies that are already making their own ethylene. There's also another kind of use case for chemical companies that don't make their own ethylene, but they use it as a feedstock. And here is where, rather than, importing ethylene or buying it from another source, we could be kind of a local, on-site production of ethylene for them. And so they use, again, their own existing emissions on site, generate their own feedstock, and then they're not reliant on, imports or, other sources of ethylene. They kind of, brought their entire, feedstock supply in-house, while they're reducing their overall emissions.
From the investor perspective, what's the most exciting part that you think that VCs should hear about this? Because you've gone very deep into the perspective of the potential customer, but as this is a breakthrough technology, you need VC investment. So how would you present this breakthrough to a VC investor?
Yeah, I think what's key here is just how integrated ethylene is into our everyday lives. You might not realize it, but so many of the things, if you just kind of like look around, so many things are going to have some form of ethylene in it. Most things with any sort of plastic or other materials. And so because of that, as I said before, it's the most widely used carbon-based chemical in the world, has a market of $200 billion. It's not going to go away. And so what we have the opportunity to do is really kind of be the basis for kind of the next phase of this ethylene industry. It's going to continue. It's continuing to grow, but it needs to become more sustainable. That's really the demand from many different angles. And there's really not any sort of commercially available routes to sustainable ethylene that exist. And so there's this major opportunity there for new processes to allow for sustainable ethylene to be available. I think that's really, really key for investors to understand just how big that opportunity is.
So we are very reliant on these kind of products. So what you are doing is, instead of finding an alternative to these products, you're finding an alternative way of producing it, right?
Exactly. Because I think there are certain applications where alternative products are great, but often that comes with more kind of switching costs, a lot more certification of new materials. And so most manufacturing chains and supply and value chains would rather just use exactly what they're used to. They don't want to have to retune their systems or even buy new equipment if they can avoid it. And so by going right up to the source and just changing at the front end of these value chains, we're making a more sustainable feedstock. And that way you can decarbonize everything that follows. That's very appealing. And so it's more likely to get uptake within the market because it's chemically identical and not something that has to be completely, you have to restructure the whole value chain around it.
This show is brought to you by We Are Palta. Communicating science and its impact through your business can be hard. We Are Palta has a team of scientific communicators, designers, and specialists dedicated to bridging the gap between science and community. Having worked with more than 25 Deeptech startups and VC firms, We Are Palta offers from creating your brand identity to managing your social media. Go to wearepalta.com, that is wearepalta.com, and learn more. From your conversations with potential investors, what part do you think that they find the most appealing about the technology you're developing?
Yeah. So I think one thing that we really focused on is looking at what are the issues with some of these potential alternatives to making ethylene in a more sustainable way. And of course, a lot of that is coming down to the cost and the complexity of it. And so what we found is that there's not really many routes that are targeting ethylene specifically. You can kind of go around, and it relies on like other sorts of feedstocks. So, for instance, one might be going to ethylene through a methanol intermediate. To get there for green methanol, you also need like a source of green hydrogen. And so when you start adding it up, there's all these little sub processes that increase the capital cost and increase the complexity. And then it becomes more difficult. For us, our process is called direct CO2 electrolysis. We take CO2 and water as our only feedstocks, so no external hydrogen. And we do the transformation of that CO2 into ethylene within a single step. And so by doing it in a single step, we really reduce that process complexity. It makes it a lot more appealing. There's less CapEx that's involved in developing it. And so that's what we've heard is very interesting about our technology, because we see a more straightforward pathway, because we're really focused on producing ethylene from our CO2.
I can confirm, low capex sounds really, really exciting.
Definitely.
Talking about the mass adoption of CO2-based chemicals, what do you think is the biggest bottleneck that the industry is currently facing? Is it economics? Is it infrastructure? Is it something else?
Yes. I think there's a few things. I think one is just the way the chemical industry is now. There's a lot of challenge with the scale that it operates at, and definitely kind of the industrial inertia, I'll call it, where it's a slow moving industry. We don't really get, when we're starting with a new technology, we don't get to benefit from the economies of scale that, the existing chemical industry has been able to develop over many decades, finding all the little efficiencies by combining different processes. And so there's a lot of opportunities for us to do that down the line, but it's hard to like fairly compare against like a new technology in vacuum versus highly integrated existing technology. And so that's one of the big challenges. I would say the second one is on the policy side. I think there's certainly been more uptake, even from like a voluntary standpoint, on doing, like carbon capture or carbon crediting. But there hasn't been quite as big a push on the chemicals and materials side for trying to reduce the carbon intensity of that. We can see kind of in the fuel space, there have been clean fuel regulations that have come in, most notably for sustainable aviation fuel. And that's driven a lot of interest in the space, a lot of offtake agreements. And so we haven't seen that in chemicals and materials yet. I think that's coming in. You can see some areas are starting to look for specific like building materials and cement and concrete. And so it's kind of inevitable that that's going to be coming in for chemicals as well. But I get the impression that until it is more certain, there's often a bit of hesitancy for large scale adoption of newer technologies to reduce the carbon emissions.
I always think that the market size of building materials gets underestimated. Do you agree?
It's funny. Sometimes people don't think about it as much, but then especially if you live in a city and you look around at like everything that's going up, there's always here in Toronto, tons of cranes. It actually is a little bit more in your face if you just kind of like look around. So, it's definitely a place that, I think can be one of the earlier ones. It can also, be driven a lot more from like policy and regulation, to encourage uptake of low carbon materials. So I think that's actually a really interesting place for, adoption of new low carbon footprint, materials.
I wanted to go back to the possibility, or rather the opportunity of not relying on importing this feedstock. You are currently developing these solutions in Canada. I wanted to ask, Do you have any specific country or regions in the world that would most greatly benefit from adopting what CERT Systems is developing?
Yeah, I think we've definitely spoken to companies from different areas where there's been interest. And I think one interesting one, I'll give an example, is in Japan. We've actually heard from a lot of companies in Japan, and there's kind of two reasons for this. One is there's not a whole lot of natural resources in Japan in terms of fossils. So right now they're importing these materials from Canada often, or from other countries, where they just get it shipped in. They get natural gas or other sorts of fossil fuel materials shipped in. And then maybe they process it there, or maybe they have the finished goods getting sent there, but they can't generate it themselves. At the same time, they're generating CO2 from their industries. And so, this provides an opportunity for them to, take that CO2 and use it, put it to good use, by making some of these raw materials that they're currently importing from elsewhere. There's also a second reason where in some ways they're also forced to look at this a little bit more. And that's also, if they're capturing the CO2, they also don't have this sort of geology to store it. And so in some countries, people talk about carbon capture and sequestration a lot, which is fine if you have the right sort of geology, the right sort of caverns to put it in. If you don't, then what's the point of capturing it, right? What can you do with that? You need to put it in something. So being able to put it into an actual useful material is something that's very appealing. And so Japan is certainly one of those places where we've seen is very interesting. I've heard similar things from some locations in Europe, also in Mexico, and anywhere where really there's industry that doesn't have that sort of subsurface geology to accommodate sequestration without transporting it really far away.
I just realized that we might be too focused on capturing carbon, but we are not asking ourselves enough, where are we going to store it?
Definitely. Yeah. It seems kind of like, yeah, once you have it, like it's a done deal, but you need to put it away. You can't just like, collect all the trash in your house and not have somewhere to put it away. Eventually you're going to be overrun with it, so you need to figure out something to do with it. And it's the same deal for CO2. If you can't put it underground, you definitely have to figure out something to do with it. And you may as well put it to use in your own processes.
Is Canada better prepared in terms of geological surface to accommodate this carbon capture in comparison to Japan or other countries?
Canada, being a really large country, certainly has kind of a mix of geologies. So, Canada traditionally has been one of the leading countries in doing carbon capture and sequestration. So there's a bunch of projects out west, where a lot of Canadian oil is being extracted from. And so it's something that's been done there. But then we look, where we're based in Ontario, there's a lot of industry here, certainly, steel and cement and other heavy industries. The geology is not quite as amenable to doing sequestration. So the total capacity isn't as high. And so certainly people are going to try and do that. But likely you would need to start looking at, hey, can we either use the CO2, or are we going to have to, put it on a boat and send it away for somebody else to store, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. I think, like, if you're doing that, you're just adding on to more emission problems, and it's really just basically sending money like on a boat and away somewhere else. So I think using it is really where we want to get into that kind of circular economy. If we're producing that CO2, we should just use it.
In particular for CERT, how did you accelerate moving from the bench and into a larger scale?
Yeah, I'll go back to our experience in the Carbon X Prize. I think that was really, really good for us because it's easy as academics to get super focused on what you're doing at the bench and not even think about scaling stuff until you're like convinced it's perfect, right? But because of the way the X Prize is structured, we had, a deadline and a scale that we were targeting. And so it really forced us to kind of say, what are the things that like we can do in time and what are the things that we can cut. It's not going to be a perfect solution yet, but we can optimize some of that later. What do we have to do to like, to check as many boxes as we can? And so that put us in a little bit of a different mindset, and forced us to think about things, think about different problems that we weren't necessarily considering at the bench scale, allowed us to find new problems that came up as we scaled, which has really informed our further development. But I think having that sort of, that driver where a deadline, nothing really motivates people better than a deadline. And so, having that was really helpful for us to kind of, force us to scale and really understand kind of what goes into doing that.
I agree. It's always good to know that you don't have to tick all the check boxes, but I'm curious, how do you figure out which box to actually check?
I don't think there's like a set way to do that all the time. I think it's really, a matter of, getting your team together, going through like, where are all the places that are risks? Where are the places that we can, we might run into problems? What is the simplest sort of way that we can address these as possible? And what are things that like aren't optimal, but also aren't critical, to running our next demonstration? Like what are the bare minimum things that, we need to be able to get to the next scale or run that next, experiment? And I think if you have the right people around the table and you're all kind of like honest with yourselves, and it can be hard because some people have their own like kind of, favorite aspects of the technology that they really want to drive. But I think everybody kind of realizing that there's the common goal of doing the scale up and reaching the next milestone. Then you can really find like what it is that you truly need versus what can we deal with later, once we've hit this next milestone.
Talking a little bit more about when you were working at the bench, what is something that 2020 Alex would not believe about today's Alex?
Yeah, I think even probably like earlier in 2020, I'm not sure that I was thinking that we would, have a company. And I think like, being able to say like, now we do have a company where we have our own space. We have an amazing team and we're all, able to kind of keep pushing on this technology. I think that's something like I didn't necessarily picture probably early on in 2020. And so, yeah, I think just being able to continue to work on this problem, but really see more of how it will fit into, the world at large and not just be kind of confined to, what we're doing, at the bench or in a lab, not just targeting, publishing our next paper. But really how does this get out into the real world? I think that's something that, wouldn't have really considered then, but I'm glad we're on that journey now.
Talking about taking this science into the real world and creating an impact, if you had to guess, which is the first industry that is going to adopt this? Is this plastics, aviation, pharma?
Yeah. And this is something that, we've spent a bunch of time kind of talking to customers in different industries. We see, a significant opportunity right now, in the sustainable packaging space, particularly with these consumer facing brands who are, driven a lot by their customers to look at sustainability. But then in particular, when we look at, packaging for food or for personal care items, there's a little bit of a gap. And the reason is because, anything that you eat or anything that you put on your skin, there's, many more considerations onto the safety of that. And so they can't really use recycled materials. So often when companies are looking for more sustainable plastics, they're looking at recycled materials. But because there's a possibility of contamination, they can't use that for food or personal care. And so there's a big gap between the availability of virgin quality and low carbon intensity plastics for packaging. And that's where we feel that we'll be able to enter the market and initially deploy our technology. And then that'll allow us to show that the process is able to scale even further, And then we'll be able to then grow that out into other sorts of markets. I think aviation is one that, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of growth in the sustainable aviation fuel space. It's not something that ethylene usually gets used for to make fuels, but because we're making sustainable ethylene, it's actually a really good precursor to get to new sorts of jet fuels in a selective process. And so we think there's a really big growth opportunity there. But that'll probably come after the sustainable packaging. And that's simply because there's a lot of scale that's needed for fuels. And so proving it out first with packaging is somewhere with some way that we can prove the scalability, enter the market, and then grow it out into a broader sector later.
Before I ask you more about the aviation industry, I was curious about the sustainable packaging. I just want to make sure that I'm following. You say that currently companies are having a hard time in adopting other ways of packaging, specifically for food and cosmetics, because of the contact that has either with skin or by eating the actual product, because of recycled materials usually have a higher chance of contamination.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And in particular for plastics like polyethylene, because you can't really break that down easily into monomers. So it's usually just mechanically recycled. And so it becomes much more difficult to remove any sort of residual contamination in there. And so that's where we'd be looking at the ability to make virgin quality polyethylene that also has a lower carbon footprint.
So since you're making the same molecule, you are avoiding that risk. That's the challenge you're solving.
Exactly, because we're making what's effectively a virgin ethylene monomer that can then be processed into polyethylene, and it acts like a virgin quality plastic that you would have made from fossil fuels. It has no contamination from anything that it was holding before, and so now we can do that with a low carbon footprint, and that'll allow these companies to avoid the risk associated with mechanically recycled materials.
Now, going back to the aviation industry, it always blows my mind the amount of emissions from airplanes, not to mention private planes, and how much of carbon is generated by that. Do you think that ethylene has the potential to reverse that, to enable for a more sustainable aviation?
Right now, people are looking at sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, because while we're looking at electrification of many different transportation methods, it's really difficult to do that for planes. You need a really dense chemical fuel to get them up in the air. And so there are a few pathways that people have identified and are accepted as accepted for making SAF. One of them right now is the alcohol to jet process, where you're starting with biomass and then you convert that into jet fuel. The way they convert it into jet fuel is you actually take that ethanol and you first make that into ethylene by dehydrating it. And so we're able to skip that whole first step of making the biomass and making the ethanol. And we can go right to the ethylene step. From there, it's a relatively simple process, fairly mature, where you're just kind of linking these ethylene molecules together until you have a molecule that's long enough to be considered jet fuel. And so we feel that this is a really good opportunity because that downstream step is fairly selective. Some of the other pathways that people are exploring to get to jet fuel use what's called Fischer-Tropsch, which is also a known process, but you tend to get a more wider distribution of molecules and you need to separate it out. So not as much of it goes into the size that you need for jet fuel. So we think that ethylene kind of combines the best of both worlds, where you're able to use clean electricity to generate it, make this use it to make ethylene, which you can then selectively process into jet fuel, but you don't need to rely on biomass as your feedstock, because there you're avoiding competition with food crops, you're avoiding potential emissions from land use changes. You're starting from CO2. And so you can kind of do that anywhere because you can source CO2 from anywhere you are in the world.
Right. That sounds Really exciting. We'll get back to talking to Alex in just 30 seconds, but first, let me tell you about We Are Palta. Raising funds for your startup requires clear and effective communication with your potential investors. That's why We Are Palta works with Deeptech companies to highlight your team strengths and your commercial traction. Discover how graphic designers can enhance your pitch deck by going to the link in the description below or by visiting wearepalta.com. That is wearepalta.com. I wanted to ask you, do you usually change the depth of the science when you communicate with investors in comparison when you communicate with potential clients?
Typically, yes. Yeah. And there's always a bit of a feeling out because sometimes you have investors that have like a significant technical background, right? So we usually try and start at fairly high level and then let the conversation kind of go where people want to go and dive down deeper as we get there. Try not to start with the deep science because then you might lose people immediately. You just kind of want to make sure that they're with you on the journey, and then you can dive down a little bit deeper.
For the investors listening to this, what's the most important part of your value proposition that they should pay attention to?
Yeah, so I think for us, it's really important that we believe that we're producing the only single step approach to get to clean ethylene. This allows us to more efficiently and effectively produce ethylene, which has a negative carbon impact. And then we can actually enter into this $200 billion market. We believe that there's not really any commercial processes that are available for clean ethylene. And so there's a major opportunity for us to enter into this market and be kind of the leader in this space.
Talking about fundraising, you've been very successful at raising a lot of non-dilutive funding. How did you manage to do that?
This is something coming from the academic background. A big part of my role while I was working at the university was seeking, grant funding. And so that's something that I brought into the team as we were spinning out CERT. We were pretty fortunate that Canada has had a number of good granting programs for early stage climate technologies. We also were able to secure funding through the Breakthrough Energy Fellowship program out of the US. And we found that this was really important for kind of bridging that gap between academia and starting up a company, because there's still technical risk at the beginning. And so you don't want to necessarily dive right into the equity fundraising right away when there's some risk to get out there. And so finding granting programs that are aligned with the overall socioeconomic benefits that you're looking to achieve and supporting the technology development, we felt was really important in the early stages, so that we could give both ourselves and future investors more confidence in the technology and its ability to scale. So we actually put a good amount of focus on securing non-dilutive funding at that time. I think it's something that we're continuing to do. We think that having a capital stack that isn't just VC, isn't just grants, isn't just revenue. I think having a combination of that, they all kind of tie into different parts of our technology development pathway. And I think it's important to pay attention to all the different sources as we're scaling.
Absolutely. That's very important. And about future investors, are you fundraising anytime soon?
Yeah, we actually have recently opened up a seed round. And so we're raising some funding that is going to allow us to scale up to our commercial scale prototype, as well as grow our commercialization team. So we're really excited that we've been able to knock out a bunch of the tech risk using our non-dilutive funding. What we're doing is kind of get all the boxes ticked off so that we'll be ready to enter the market. And so that's what our seed round is for right now. And so we just kicked that off. And it's been great just to be able to get around, get perspectives from different investors, both on the corporate and financial side.
Do you have any specific advice to other climate tech funders on how to de-risk their technology in the early days?
Yeah, I think one thing that's really, really important, I think, is to talk to potential customers, talk to companies in the industry. You don't have to be trying to sell them anything at this point, but really to talk to them. What are their problems? And, this is advice that you get in any accelerator or anything, but I think a lot of, especially technical founders, don't necessarily do it. They kind of think, because my technology is good, everybody's going to come. It's going to all work out. But I think it's really important to understand, what is the technology good for, and where can it be best applied? And talking to your customers, potential customers or potential partners early on is really important because, they'll know things about the space that you don't know. And you might be able to bring a new perspective on some of that, and see better ways that you can apply your technology. So it also gets them, more involved in your development and your success because, they've been able to, provide some input to you. So definitely recommend it's never too early to start talking to different customers and different potential partners. The partnership is another thing that's very important because the space is hard and you can't do everything. So you want to focus on developing your core tech and your company, find partners that can support you along the way. It's not like building an app where, you just need a garage and a couple of laptops and you can go do it all yourself. You're really going to rely on a lot of other partnerships and, others in the sector to be able to scale it.
I agree with you that having this perspective from the potential customer is very, very important. I want to ask you, how do you communicate that to investors? How can investors tell that you are incorporating all the feedback that you are actually talking with customers?
Yeah, I think one thing is being, you can be pretty clear about, these are the people we've spoken to, give them a sense on, the customer discovery work you've done, have quotes from your conversations if you have them. If you can get letters of support or letters of intent, I think that's also really helpful to show, maybe you're not at the stage where today you can sell something, but if we develop it, there are potential customers waiting. I think this is really important to show to investors. So it's not just you telling them that this is a problem that people are looking to be solved, but other people are saying it's a problem. So being able to talk to those customers and asking them if they're open to, writing a letter or down the line taking a call from an investor to explain that it is a problem in their field that they're looking for. I think is really, really important, really valuable for founders to communicate that to investors.
I want to hear your perspective about IP. How do you ensure that you are protecting your intellectual property in this field?
There's a few different ways that we do it. And again, this is one on the partnership side, talking to finding a good IP lawyer or patent agent that knows your space, understands kind of what makes a good patent. I think being able to have conversations with those sorts of experts is one thing. Again, going with your team and digging down a little, what are kind of the key things that we did to make advancements in our technology. But then of course, you're not a huge corporation. You don't have the funding to patent every single thing that you invent. And so, it's a bit of a balance between how do we protect things through patents versus, keeping trade secrets versus even publishing stuff so you can't be blocked on things. It's really interesting, and it's something that I don't think there's a cookie cutter answer for, because it'll depend on your sector and what others are doing in your sector as well. But I think it's something that you want to make sure you're constantly having conversations with experts around you and with your team, so that you at least know what's in your own pipeline, which are again, super key things that you must patent or protect in some other way. Because without that, then there's not a whole lot that you can do, right? And so it is a really key part of it. And again, something that oftentimes, for founders coming out of academia, they're not necessarily thinking about as much. So similar to the customer discovery, it's never really too early to start looking at your IP position and talking to experts on building an IP strategy.
100%. It's never too early. You just mentioned that people coming from academia have to make this switch. Any other major switch that you can think of that coming from academia, it's very, very important to do when jumping into a startup?
For a lot of people in academia, you get used to doing everything on your own. A lot of times you get your project and you're both the project manager and the lab technician and like copy editor and all these different things. And I think it's really important to learn, to work as a team, and surround yourself with good people that can do some of these tasks. You don't have to do everything. It's probably worth figuring out and being honest with yourself about, what are the things you like to do? What are the things that you add the most value, and where can we, bring in expertise to help, help move the team and the company along as fast as possible. That comes with its own challenges that, depending on what sort of lab you worked with in academia, has its own challenges. You might not be prepared for how much of being a founder is handling HR concerns. And so that's somewhere where, make sure you do that. It is important. Building a strong company is like not just about the technical side, but it's about like building a team that both has the technical skills, is a group of people that is aligned with your mission, and people that frankly you want to be working with every day. So I think that's really important.
I'm sure that you've accumulated a lot of experience, a lot of skills during all these years. So I want to ask you if you could go back to day one of CERT Systems and give yourself an advice, what would that advice be?
Yeah, I think related to what I just said, I think not being afraid to ask for support, ask for help on different aspects. I've heard it phrased as, asking is free. So don't be afraid to ask if you're having a problem, if you're not sure how to do something. It's not a sign of weakness to go ask for advice, and it's something that can really make a difference in helping you move along faster, being able to overcome obstacles so you can really stay on track and go after what you need to be doing.
What are some tailwinds about climate tech for the next couple of years that people might be ignoring?
Yeah, I think obviously the macroeconomic environment is a little bit tricky now. But I think there's a big opportunity for a kind of rebuilding and growing out supply chain resiliency with climate tech. It's not always purely because it's more sustainable, but I think there's a lot of ways where these new technologies can be used to help companies and help countries kind of build up more of that resiliency within their supply chains. I also think that something that we've really been seeing over the past, say, decade is, although when people talk about clean tech 1.0 as like big issue where, lots of people lost their money, we're starting to see a lot of the fruits of that where there's tons of renewable electricity coming in. And so, whether or not, we're trying to do it, the whole energy mix is changing, and that gives a lot more opportunities for new technologies. Everything kind of is working together, and we're going to see that this sort of electrification is going to make other sorts of technologies such as electrolysis and other things much more attractive as we move into the future. So I think those are kind of key things that will drive new climate technologies forward.
If everything goes according to the plan, what role will CERT Systems play in this new scenario?
We see ourselves as really enabling the closing of this carbon loop. Our technology provides an electrified way of converting, carbon dioxide, which is the final waste product of fossil fuels, Instead, we're going to make that into a brand new material that you traditionally make from fossil fuels. So you can really close that loop, eventually cut out fossil fuels from that process. I fundamentally believe that like people shouldn't have to make significant sacrifices in, the quality or performance of their lives or the products that they use in order to achieve sustainability. So we see ourselves as providing a way to make the same sort of products that we're used to, live our lives, better than the last generation instead of getting worse than the last generation. We should be able to live better, but more sustainably at the same time. And that should all go hand in hand. And that's where we see ourselves fitting, is enabling that sort of future.
What's one thing that you believe to be true, but most people around you might disagree with?
I believe that a lot of these renewable chemicals, sort of technologies, including ours, but some of the other cool tech that's coming up, I think they'll be implemented earlier than people think. A lot of times people are looking at it, as, we'll still be on fossil fuels for many, many years, but I think that they're going to start coming in. And as it scales, that'll just accelerate, faster and faster, in the same way that, we've seen renewable electricity every year, more of it's being deployed than was predicted even just the year before. And I think that we'll see a similar sort of growth for sustainable chemicals, sustainable materials as well.
Talking about the immediate future, what's next for CERT?
We're excited to be scaling up our technology. As I mentioned, we're currently raising a seed round, and what we hope that'll be is kind of a springboard so that we can actually start entering the market, start demonstrating our low carbon ethylene materials in fields like sustainable packaging, where we're really excited to really start showing that, really get some tangible products that people can actually see and touch, to really get a sense of, this is what the future is. This is product that's made from CO2 emissions. We can have the same experience and performance without having to rely on fossil fuels. And so we're very excited to be moving towards that, where people can actually get their hands on some of our products.
Alex, where can people find out more about CERT and get in touch with you?
So our website is CO2 CERT, CERT.com. You can also find us. We're fairly active on LinkedIn. And if people want to email me, it's alex@co2cert.com.
Awesome. I'll make sure to link that on the show notes. And Alex, thank you very much. Thank you very much for making the future more exciting and for being part of the show.
Yeah. Thanks so much, JP. It was a pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for watching this episode of Science VC. I hope you found it valuable and insightful. If you did, consider subscribing so you don't miss the great conversations coming up in future episodes. And if you're looking for more, YouTube's algorithm has selected this video for you. It's a great way to keep exploring deep tech and venture capital, so give it a try. I think you'll find it interesting. That's it for now. I'm JP, and I'll see you in the next episode.